Christopher. It's such a pleasure to meet you. How are you today?
I'm good. How you doing, Nick?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat. I'm a big fan of your films, a big fan of
Uh,
you. So I'm really excited to talk drop.
Thank
And
you.
one thing I really wanted to mention right off the bat is that I would love to see a sketch that is about Alice and Janney's hat that is scared of heights. I think that is actually a genuinely incredibly funny concept, but it really made me think that a lot of your films, even though there are thriller and horror elements to them, there is so much levity and humor in it as well. And I think there's such an interesting relationship between thriller and horror and comedy. And I'm curious
hmm
to know what you feel about the relationship between those two, even though they may can be considered two different genres and elements, that sort of symbiotic relationship between the two.
I mean, I have always felt like they make really interesting companions, because I think the structure of a joke and the structure of a scare are very similar. Um, and and I think that life, is filled with both. You know what I mean? Like any given day, you could wake up in a comedy and find yourself in a horror movie an hour later, and that's just sort of the cadence of life. And so I don't think that they're very disparate and strange. Um, I think what's different here in Drop versus some of my other films is that humor is only used in a very specific and grounded way. You know what I mean?
Yes.
The movie we're watching is a very classic thriller, but it has punctuations of humor mainly provided by one character in particular, our waiter. And that's really just to sort of help give the audience an opportunity to like take a breath
Yeah.
and to relieve some tension, because otherwise you're asking the audience to stay in this very sustained place for a long period of time. And my concern with something like that is that, it can get monotonous or you could just get worn out from that as opposed to like being in the tension and then all of a sudden there's a punctuation of humor, but then you get to go back into the tension. And so for me, it just makes for a more enjoyable experience overall. And I just like humor. I mean, I love to laugh.
As audience members, we love it too, and we appreciate you adding those elements in there. It might be a bit of a big question, but do you feel like as a filmmaker, is it harder to make audiences scared or laugh? Do you see that there's a difference between the two in how you have to construct those things?
I mean, they can be very similar. I will say, I think that humor, I think you have a little more of the element of surprise, because there's so many different ways to write a joke, or to perform a joke. And I find that like when it comes to visual scares specifically, I think the audience is so savvy and they have accumulated so much information and sort of they know where like every time a character like, in a movie, like in a horror film, like when they go to the refrigerator and open the door, everyone's
Yeah.
like, he's behind the door. And so there's a visual language that we all become really familiar with. And so it becomes harder and harder to find ways to spring a trap, on an unsuspecting audience member. But I still feel like, they still are both very similar.
Sure. Yeah, as I said at the start, I'm a fan of your work, and I love the stylistic, visual choices you use to direct your films. I think with Drop, like the camera on top of the RC car going around the house, or even just how you use the camera to sort of show the space in the restaurant. I'm curious to know how much your visual style is inspired by location, by premise.
I mean, it's very driven by location, and I think in the past, I was always kind of having to work with the space that I was given. You know what I mean? Like, in the lower budget world that I've operated in quite a bit, you don't have the luxury of building your sets really. So you are trying to figure out how to make things look visually interesting with what you have. What was really different about Drop was that we got to build this beautiful and very large set. And with that came a certain level of just latitude and malleability, and like I could put the camera wherever I wanted, and that was really like a first for me, career-wise, and it was so special to just have that much creative freedom. And so my director of photography, Mark Spicer, and I, we were like kids in a candy shop, like getting to create all of these unique shots, especially because the story allows for it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not a director that likes to be flashy and overly stylistic. I think it has to be rooted in story first. And because the movie's so subjective and we're telling this from her point of view, it allowed for me to do all these things that I normally would not do, just because I needed to put the audience inside of her head.
It was unreal. Like I said, it looked incredible, and I think the restaurant space that way you move around, it really put us in there. And another thing that really stuck out to me, and I think it's something that not a lot of directors would do, is the actual style of font and the way you produce or way you show us the text messages. I feel like so many films I see would just have the iMessage bubble and that's it. But the way you integrate it into the frames, I'm curious to know what sort of the decision making process was behind. But how then do you shoot a film knowing that's where you're going to place text in that points, because it's so purposeful?
Yeah, it was interesting. I realized very early on that, like, I was not going to do phone inserts or do bubbles, because I felt like that would just get really boring. And the huge challenge of the movie is you're having to create a character where they don't exist. You know what I mean? Like, we never see this person who's doing this to her. And so how do we create a sense of a conversation happening between two people? It can't just be, oh, I'm looking at my phone. And so, we went into the process knowing that we were going to need what I knew was some form of an animated text that would appear on screen, and that the shots needed to be designed to facilitate that and make sure that we had space. And so all of that was thought out in advance. And so what was really interesting is that when we went into post-production and then we started to work with the company that was actually creating all of these text messages, I remember their reaction to seeing all of the footage where we had mocked it up for them, because they were like, oh my God, we don't have to figure this out. Like, you did it a long time ago. And so it was really cool, but also, like, letting that character really shine through the messages. You feel this attitude from them, and just also the way that they were interactive and menacing, and how, like, there's moments where, characters walk through the messages and they distort. And I just think it was visually really fun and interesting way to approach texting.
It was, and it was so awesome. I truly loved the style of that. And I'll wrap up with this, and I just want to end by going back to the beginning. I loved the opening credit sequence of this film, and I feel like you're someone who really appreciates a good opening credit sequence. Had these like Halloween vibes, Bond vibes. There's so much going on in there. I'm
Yeah.
curious to know whether it was an inspiration or not behind it, but what's an opening credit scene that has sort of stuck out to you, one that sort of is formative in your mind as an
Oh
iconic?
God! Well, first of all, yeah, I mean, every Bond movie ever made, they're all so good. I think that Fincher is another director who, like, always does, like, these banger, amazing sequences. And someone that worked on the movie at Blumhouse very wisely said that, like, a good opening credit sequence is a promise to the audience. And I thought that was a really eloquent way of putting it. And what's so cool is that, like, what we did here is not normal in terms of, like, Blumhouse. We usually can't afford to do that, And what was so great is that we finished this movie 3 days early, which is pretty rare.
Yeah.
And so I had extra money allocated, so I was able to do it because everything in that title sequence is real. None of it's animated.
It looked great, yeah.
Yeah, and so we actually had a whole element shoot on a sound stage where we rigged all of those props, many of which were from the actual movie, and then we rigged them with explosives and we blew them up with a high-speed camera. So, like, it was so cool, and I got to, funny enough, work with a company that is owned and driven by someone I went to school with, that I grew up with. Which is another crazy little sort of funny piece of the story. But yeah, I love the opening title sequence. I think it's really elegant and cool.
I loved it as well. And like you said, it's a promise to the audience, and the promise was kept. I really, really enjoyed this film, Christopher. I really appreciate your time chatting about it today. I hope we get to do it again soon, man. I'm a fan of you, and I hope we get to chat again for what we got coming up next.
Thanks so much.